An early Shabbat Shalom from Congregation Bet Tefillah here in beautiful Scottsdale, Arizona. So friends, I'm sure you've met a hot-tempered person or two in your lives. Well, let me ask you a question. If you take a group of those people, how many of them would be needed to take a picture off a wall? I'll tell you how many. 10. 1 to hold the picture, and 9 to break the wall. Well, friends, it seems that in this week's coming portion of Chukat and Balak, there are two portions combined this week, but in the first of the two in Chukat, there is a story of someone also striking not a wall, but a rock. What is the story? It's the story of the Jewish people thirsty for waters in the desert. And then God instructs Moses and Aaron, "V'dibartem el hasela v'natan meimav," and you shall speak to the rock, and the rock will produce water. What does Moses do? As we all know, he strikes the rock instead of speaking to it. When God notices that, he says to Moses, "Well, I'm sorry, because you struck the rock instead of speaking to it, as I commanded you to do, you will be punished. And your punishment will be that you will not be able to enter the promised land with the generation that you have led so committedly." Now, my friends, it begs the question, really? Did Moses deserve that punishment for that sin? Why? First of all, the results were the same. After he struck the rock still produced water. Secondly, Moses' big dream was to enter the promised land. After he fought for his nation for 40 years with blood, sweat, and tears, does he not deserve to finally arrive at his destination, the promised land, the land flowing with milk and honey that he had so wanted to be in, to die in? Why this punishment? And the answer, my friend, I think speaks to a lesson in education that we ought to take to heart, especially in our day and age. Moses, the commentaries point out, was a leader for the generation that had seen suffering, felt pain, had been tortured in Egypt as slaves, and then emerged from that as a free nation that received the Torah on Mount Sinai. Moses was a leader for a generation that was built with suffering, that could take pain, that was able to indeed listen to words of rebuke and not be too affected by them, that those words belittle the person or diminish the greatness of the person. They knew what it was to have true suffering, and therefore rebuke built them and did not destroy them. The generation that was coming into the land of Israel was a generation that was much softer inside, was a generation that was pampered by God, embraced by his clouds of glory, given food from the heavens, the manna itself, was a generation that knew no enemy, and if it did, those enemies were overcome with very quickness and with ease. It's a generation that was to be treated with kids' gloves, as they say, with tenderness. When God saw that Moses hit the rock, he said, "I'm sorry, that's not the language of this generation entering the land of Israel. That generation needs to be spoken with love. They weren't built through suffering. They won't be able to tell the difference between true suffering and rebuke from the outside. They won't be built by criticism. It's a generation that needs you to speak to them, not to hit them. And therefore you won't be able to lead this generation to the promised land. You don't speak their language." Friends, I believe that this is true for our generation too. The previous generation indeed knew hardship, and therefore they could take hardship with tremendous resilience and persistence. They could take criticism as words of love, because they had experienced what true pain means. This generation, on the other hand, this generation has been quite pampered. This generation doesn't know the language of hardship. This generation, therefore, won't be able to relate to criticism and to differentiate between it and it coming from love and difficulties that do not come from love. And therefore, the only language we can speak to this generation is a language of love. It's a language of devotion, of care, of tenderness, of gentleness. I'm reminded of the words of the late Lubavitcher Rebbe to Herman Wouk, the famed author, when Herman Wouk was speaking about the youth, the next generation, the future. And the Rebbe made the comment that you can't tell the youth of today what to do, but you can explain to them everything. You can't tell them. You can't use the language of the stick that hits the rock. You have to be able to explain, to speak from the heart, and then your words will enter their heart. That's the language that they understood. Friends, I believe that in education today, really the only method that has proven to be effective is a method of love, whether it's education towards our children, education towards the peers and the relatives and the friends that we may have. When we speak a language of love, that love evokes love, and then love fills the world. But it's true not just for interpersonal relationships. I think it is true also for the relationship that God ought to have with these children in our generation. We turn to God. It's enough to bestow upon your children here on earth pain and suffering. It's time for you to treat us with love as we treat our youth also with love. I'm reminded of the story of the Klosenberg Rebbe, Rabbi Yekutiel Yehuda Halberstam, whose yahrzeit, his 26th yahrzeit, was just this week on the 9th of Tammuz. In his very last speech before his death, the 9th of Tammuz, 1994, he said to God, God, I ask you, just as I tell my Hasidim to treat their children and their loved ones with love, with no punishment, with no hardship, just with love. We've seen too much hardship. This was a Holocaust survivor who had lost his entire family in the Holocaust speaking. We have seen too much hardships, he told God. Now, the language that we need to speak is the language of love. And just as I asked that of my Hasidim, God, please, I ask that of you too. Stop speaking the language of the stick with your children here on earth. Speak to them with the language of love. Let us hear your love. Let us sense your love. Let us see your love in this world. Let the redemption finally come. These were Rabbi Yekutiel Yehuda Halberstam's last words here on earth. Words that need to be internalized. Words that need to be practiced. Friends, with that language of speaking to the rock, with love, not hitting it, but attending to it with the depths of our heart, with true care, with warmth, with that language, we will walk to our ultimate redemption, to the redemption that will express in its complete beauty the language of love by God Himself. May it happen speedily. Amen ve'amen.
Shalom Aleichem, Malachi Yasharet, Malachi